We are learning more about the 8 victims, 6 of them Asian women, in the Atlanta area spa shootings on Tuesday. Memorials were set up at the sites of the attacks, and investigators say the suspect denies any racial motivation. But given how targeted the attacks were, many are pointing to the long history of racism and sexism against Asian women. A new report found that Asian American women were the victims in 68% of hateful incidents against Asian Americans in the last year. Yeon Choimorrow is the executive director of the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum and joins us to discuss. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to start with what the suspect is saying, that it's not about race, this is about a sexual addiction. But given the targets of the attacks and given the people that were attacked, does that make sense to you?
No, it doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense to most of us in the community, partly because that's also not necessarily how racism works in this country. It is sometimes about the individual act of racism that people perpetuate, but often it's because of the structural racism that they're a part of. And as you mentioned earlier, there is a long arc of racialized sexism, racialized misogyny that's directed at Asian American women that's at play. And so you cannot separate the two in the incident that took place in Atlanta.
Yeon, we keep hearing that racism is experienced differently in some cases for Asian American women in a hypersexual way. What do you mean exactly by that?
Yeah, you know, that's really the most common way that Asian American women experience racism in this country. It always has a sexual undertone. Well, not always, but oftentimes it does.
Like
right?
what? Like what?
Like, so for example, you know, when I experience public harassment around COVID, it's not just about me being Asian, it's also about me being a woman, right? And the kind of experiences we have in terms of sexual harassment, it is not just sexual harassment, it is often very racialized, right? So for example, you know, when I first immigrated to this country, I came when I was 18 years old, and I would often get stopped by men and who would ask me, "Are you Korean?" And then if I would say yes, then they would, you know, launch into, you know, some Korean phrase they know, and then how much they love Korea, and, you know, they served in the military, and how I remind them of some girlfriend they had, and then say something really inappropriate, right? Like, that is the kind of ways we experience racialized sexism in this country.
So, Yeon, how would you say that pop culture has influenced the way we see Asian American women?
Well, I think history has informed pop culture, and pop culture has, you know, emulated those stereotypes, right? And I think the way it plays out often is in the way we appropriate our cultural you know, outfits and costumes, and you see that a lot at Halloween, right? And sort of exotifying our look, you know, even in the way that people do makeup, and you know, those things are perpetuated in our broadly in our mainstream culture.
I'm looking for education too, Yeon. I was talking to a friend of mine who's Asian and said many times people think submissive or timid or very open to engaging in sexual acts because it was said so by a man. Do you think that there is something to that? I want people to really understand what's being said here. I don't want us to dance around this. I think this is so important. Yeah. And I think many people don't know what is happening in this country and how serious it is.
Yeah, and you know, we've got to go all the way to the beginning of, you know, Asian American women being in the United States, right? You know, go all the way back to 1875, the Page Act, right? What it did basically assumed that people that look like me, East Asian women, were coming to the United States for the sole purpose of prostitution. So off the bat, you know, our existence in this country has always been framed around the hypersexualization of our bodies and our looks. And then, you know, move along a couple centuries and, into the militarization of, you know, the Pacific Rim, you know, the Asian Pacific, Pacific, where Korea, Okinawa, Philippines, Vietnam, where the U.S. military personnel have gone there, and again, really commodified Asian American women for their pleasures, their desires, and bring those ideas and fetishes and fantasies back to the United States and continue to try perpetuate that on those of us who live here.
Sung-Young, what do we need to take away from this moment?
We need to take away from this moment that, I'm glad that we're starting to have this conversation, but this cannot be it. Asian American women have been long invisible in this society, right? We're being told this is not a racist incident. It is a racist incident because of the way Asian American women experience racism in our country. And so what I want us to walk away from is that all of us find a way to talk about what happened in Atlanta in a way that honors the women whose lives were taken too soon in a very tragic way, and to understand and connect the political and historical context in which that tragedy took place.
Yeon Choimorrow, we want to continue this conversation too, and we will. Thank you for being with us.